For 20 years, the world watched Bruce Willis decline in real time and decided he was lazy. Film critics wrote him off. Online channels built entire audiences mocking his performances. The internet called him greedy, disconnected, and washed up. None of them were right, and by the time anyone understood what was actually happening inside his brain, the damage those opinions caused was already permanent. Bruce Willis, frontotemporal dementia patient, retired actor, father of 5, and one of the most misread public figures of the last 2 decades, turned 70 in 2026, living inside a carefully structured home environment designed to slow the psychological unraveling that no amount of money or fame can reverse. His language has deteriorated to the point where conversation as most people understand it belongs mostly to the past. His daily life now consists of short walks, time outdoors, quiet music, and the presence of people who have refused to leave his side regardless of what this disease keeps taking from him. What makes his story worth examining is not the diagnosis itself, but everything that happened before it, and how completely the world misread every single sign. Start in New Jersey, with a young man who had no obvious reason to believe Hollywood would ever open a door for him. Willis spent his early years grinding through small television appearances, building nothing that looked like momentum from the outside, collecting roles that kept the lights on without doing much else. Miami Vice gave him a few minutes of screen time. Auditions gave him rejection in bulk. Moonlighting arrived in 1985 and changed the entire equation, a television series that ran until 1989 where he played Detective David Addison with a sharp wit and natural magnetism that audiences responded to almost immediately, earning him an Emmy in 1987 and a national profile that no careful career management could have manufactured from scratch. Die Hard came next in 1988, and the studio system was genuinely unconvinced he could carry it. Action films at that point belonged to a specific physical archetype, large and invulnerable and emotionally sealed shut, and Willis fit none of those criteria. What he delivered instead was something the genre had never quite seen: a man who bled, who complained, who was visibly afraid, and who kept moving forward anyway through sheer refusal to stop. John McClane became one of cinema's most enduring characters, not because he was superhuman, but because he was completely ordinary, and that film grossing over $140 million worldwide, while redefining what an action hero was allowed to be, stands as one of the more consequential moments in 1980s Hollywood history. The decade that followed belonged to Willis in a way that's difficult to overstate. Pulp Fiction landed in 1994, and accepting a lower salary to work with Quentin Tarantino demonstrated something his later career critics never gave him credit for: genuine artistic instincts that extended well beyond the payday. The Fifth Element and Armageddon turned 1,997 and 1,998 into consecutive summers of global commercial dominance. The Sixth Sense arrived in 1999 and remains, by most serious critical assessment, the finest dramatic performance of his career. His personal life generated attention that matched his professional output. The 1,987 marriage to Demi Moore made them one of the defining couples of their generation, and when it ended in 2000, both handled the transition with discipline uncommon in the entertainment industry. 3 daughters came from that marriage: Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah, and the co-parenting relationship that followed was genuinely cooperative rather than merely cordial for appearances. Emma Hemming entered his life in 2009, they married that year, and 2 more daughters followed, Mabel and Evelyn. Friends described a father who handled school runs personally and spoke openly about wanting to protect his children from Hollywood's more corrosive realities. And then, somewhere around the turn of the millennium, something started shifting. The changes were subtle enough in those early years that they registered as personality rather than pathology. Colleagues noticed a flatness creeping into performances that hadn't been there before, a slight reduction in the presence that had always been his most reliable professional asset. Television interviews from around 2013 show a man who appears irritated by questions, offering short answers where he once would have been expansive, and the viewing public reached for the obvious explanation: he had simply stopped caring. Scripts on his film sets were being quietly simplified without public acknowledgement. An earpiece, referred to in the industry as an earwig, became a regular fixture, allowing assistants to feed him lines in real time while cameras rolled and nobody in the audience knew anything unusual was happening. by the late 2010s, Willis was appearing in a volume of direct-to-video productions that seemed to confirm every unflattering theory about his motivations, with some estimates placing him in as many as 8 such projects within a single calendar year. Film analysis channels dissected his performances frame by frame and found a pattern that felt impossible to argue against. Willis almost always seated during scenes, action sequences built entirely around stunt doubles, dialogue that sounded dubbed in post-production. What nobody knew was that the people closest to him on those sets were seeing something that had nothing to do with professional indifference. Directors would later describe moments where Willis fired a prop weapon before anyone called action, appeared uncertain about basic blocking, seemed genuinely unsure why he was standing in a particular spot. One filmmaker described guiding him through scenes as puppeting, where each step required careful direction rather than natural, professional instinct. Close to 24 cast and crew members would eventually acknowledge having sensed something deeply wrong, and nearly all of them stayed quiet because production continued, and the medical reality behind what they were witnessing hadn't been named yet. March 30th, 2022 is the date everything changed, when the Willis family released a statement confirming an aphasia diagnosis and announcing his immediate and permanent retirement from acting. Aphasia is a neurological condition that disrupts the ability to speak, understand language, read, and write. And for anyone paying attention to the preceding years, the announcement functioned like a key turning in a lock. Every confusing piece of the professional picture suddenly had a different explanation. The fatigue was neurological deterioration. The simplified scripts were medical accommodations. The earpiece was a coping mechanism for a man whose brain was losing its grip on language while he was still showing up to work. None of it had been laziness. None of it had been greed. Less than a year later, in February 2023, the family delivered a more complete picture. The aphasia was one symptom of frontotemporal dementia, FTD, a progressive neurological disease that targets the brain's frontal and temporal lobes, the regions responsible for personality, behavior, emotional regulation, and language. The distinction from Alzheimer's matters because FTD doesn't typically begin with memory loss. What it attacks first are the things that make a person recognizable to the people who love them: their emotional responses, their behavioral patterns, their communication, the specific texture of who they are. Families living through FTD often describe watching a loved one become psychologically unfamiliar long before they become physically fragile, and that particular form of loss sits in a category of pain that most people have no framework for until they're inside it. Emma Hemming Willis noticed periods when her husband seemed unusually distant, less emotionally present, harder to reach in ways she couldn't initially name. The early changes were subtle enough to attribute to stress or exhaustion or the demands of a 4-decade career. And that's exactly the problem with FTD in its early stages. It mimics things that aren't medical emergencies until the medical emergency becomes undeniable. When the full picture finally came into focus, the family made a unified decision: complete retirement, total redirection of resources toward his comfort and safety, and a commitment to his dignity that every subsequent public update has reflected. Frontotemporal dementia destroys nerve cells in the frontal and temporal lobes over time, producing measurable physical shrinkage in those brain regions as the disease progresses. Patients experience dramatic personality changes, severe emotional withdrawal, compulsive behaviors, and a progressive loss of communication capacity. Many gradually lose the ability to perform basic daily tasks: getting dressed safely, navigating familiar rooms, managing fundamental aspects of personal care. One neurologist characterized advanced FTD as a particular kind of cruelty because it removes behavior, personality, and language simultaneously, dismantling the entire sense of self while the physical body continues to function. No treatment exists to halt the progression. Medical intervention targets symptom management and routine structure, and that is the full extent of what medicine currently offers. Anosognosia, a neurological inability to perceive the extent of one's own illness, defines much of how Willis experiences his daily life in 2026. He carries little apparent awareness of how far the disease has taken him. Emma has described this publicly as both a mercy and a burden. A mercy because his days can unfold without the terror that full awareness would bring, and a burden because the emotional weight of knowing sits entirely with the family. Research on dementia caregiving consistently points to the toll this sustained labor extracts. with some studies estimating that close to 30% of primary caregivers for severe dementia patients die before the person they are caring for, often from conditions directly connected to chronic stress and exhaustion. His care structure in 2026 is continuous. A professional caregiving team provides round-the-clock support and coordinates with medical specialists to monitor changes and adjust his daily structure. The home environment has been deliberately arranged to minimize confusion and reduce risk, with familiar surroundings, predictable rhythms, and carefully controlled stimulation. Emma has articulated the family's guiding philosophy as meeting him where he is, adapting entirely to his current cognitive reality rather than measuring each day against who he used to be. Emotional recognition persists even where language has largely failed. He responds to familiar faces, specific tones of voice, gestures that carry meanings his brain can still receive even when the words that would normally accompany them have gone quiet. Family remains the irreplaceable element of everything the medical structure surrounds. Rumor, Scout, and Tallulah visit regularly. Mabel and Evelyn grow up in a household where caregiving is part of daily life. Demi Moore has remained involved with a consistency that says something real about what Willis built in his personal relationships during the years when he was most fully himself. In January 2026, Emma helped organize a charitable exhibition through Christie's, directed at raising awareness and funding for frontotemporal dementia research. She has appeared in major media forums, including CNN, to speak about caregiver strain, the need for earlier diagnosis, and the reality that millions of families face this disease without the financial advantages the Willis family can access. The message she returns to consistently is that no family should navigate neurodegenerative disease without support structures that currently don't exist in adequate form. The professional legacy Willis built across 4 decades requires nothing further from him to sustain itself. Die Hard redefined American action cinema. Pulp Fiction demonstrated that a bankable star could take genuine artistic risks and have them pay off. The Sixth Sense remains one of the more technically accomplished narrative surprises in the history of studio filmmaking. These films have settled into the permanent shared language of cinema, and that legacy is already complete. What has emerged alongside it, quieter and less obvious, is what the response to his illness has demonstrated about the people around him. The transparency his family chose when privacy would have been easier. The unity maintained across a family structure that includes 2 marriages and 5 children. The commitment to dignity over spectacle at every point where spectacle would have been more immediately rewarding. None of that belongs to the Bruce Willis, who ran across skyscrapers and made enormous amounts of money doing it. All of it belongs to something quieter that was always underneath the fame and has simply become more visible now that the fame has stepped aside. Frontotemporal dementia awareness has grown measurably since his diagnosis became public, and Willis's case has become one of the primary reference points for that conversation, not because celebrity illness is more important than ordinary illness, but because it reaches audiences that ordinary illness cannot. People who had never heard of FTD now understand what it does. People who dismissed his late career as professional failure now understand what they were actually watching. The disease remains widely misunderstood, often progressing well past the point of early intervention before anyone names it correctly, and his case continues to serve as a concrete example of why behavioral and language changes deserve neurological evaluation rather than character judgments. By 2026, Bruce Willis no longer speaks in sentences his audience would recognize from 40 years of film and television. His world has contracted to the dimensions of a carefully maintained daily routine, and inside that routine, something continues to function that no disease has yet reached completely: the recognition of people he loves. It arrives without words now, through a look, through a gesture, through the particular quality of attention that passes between people who have shared decades of an actual life. That recognition is what remains. And the people around him have decided, clearly and without ambivalence, that what remains is enough to stay for.